So, welcome everyone. My name is Anaïs. I am the FarmD Community of Practice Analyst, and welcome to you all to our webinar on assessing risk in agriculture and how to mobilize global capital for financing the transition. This webinar is organized and promoted by the Platform for Agricultural Risk Management PALM through FarmD and with Climate Bonds Initiative. Before starting, I wanted to quickly go over the housekeeping rules. First of all, this session will be recorded and available online on replay and shared on our website and social media. At the end of this webinar, we will dedicate a session for you to ask questions, but you are more than welcome to ask them also all through the webinar using the chat box on the bottom of your screen, and we will direct them during the dedicated time. Also, I will now share the link to our FarmD Community of Practice, which is an interactive space for exchanges and to receive peer-to-peer support on agricultural risk management, but also to share knowledge and best practices. We highly encourage your subscription and look forward to exchange with you there. If there are any technical issues, you can reach out through a direct message to the FarmD via the chat function. And now, without further ado, I will leave the floor to Maria for her welcoming remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Anaïs. Hello, everyone. Welcome. I know that we have people that is joining us today from different parts of the world. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's a pleasure to be with you today. So before starting, I think that it's important to introduce myself. My name is Maria Alejandra Pulido, and I am the Sustainable Agriculture Lead for the EU here in Climate Bonds Initiative. Today, I'm pleased to moderate this webinar, and it's brought to you, as Anaïs already mentioned, thanks to FarmD, PARM, and Climate Bonds Initiative. As you will know already, this is going to be a webinar that is going to focus on assessing risk in agriculture and how to mobilize the global capital for financing the transition. But we brought together a stellar panel of experts for today's conversation. So I'm thrilled to welcome Francesca Núñez, who is the Capacity Development and Private Sector Specialist at PARM. Francesca, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Oh, glad to be here too. Thank you.
Now, please welcome Aris van der Velden. She is the Director of Learning and Innovation at IDH. Aris, it's a pleasure to have you here too.
Yes, thanks you, Maria. It's a pleasure as well.
Last but not least, let me introduce to you Regis Tirado, who is the Agri-food Senior Manager at Climate Bonds Initiative.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Maria. A pleasure to be here today.
Thank you, Regis. Before we get into the questions, it's important to highlight how evaluating risk in agriculture informs decision-making to support risk mitigation strategies and as well facilitate the effective resource allocation and enhance sustainability, resilience, and as well policy development. A comprehensive risk assessment, actually a strategy ensures agriculture systems long-term viability and as well the sustainability. Several initiatives are underway to address risk management and promote the sustainable investments in the agri-food system. These include fostering awareness and accelerating sustainable investments through the science-backed and as well concessions-driven transitions pathways. These pathways offer clear guidance for the agri-food system, integrating social, economical, and as well environmental considerations. But moreover, there is a focus on developing a holistic methodology for agricultural risk assessment, covering all different elements. This approach enables policymakers and as well investors and stakeholders to comprehend risk and make informed decisions. And actually, that's why we're here today, because we believe that knowledge exchange, particularly around lessons learned from adding countries to integrate risk management into their development strategies and investment plans, promotes mainstream of effective risk assessment methods. And of course, it will contribute to the sustainable development in the agri-food sector. But let's discuss this together with our experts. Once again, before starting, I just want to remind the audience that you can actually share your thoughts, any comments and questions on the chat. So please don't wait till the end of the panel to do that. You can start from now. Well, to start the conversation, I think that one of the main questions is what is the role of science-based and conscience-driven transition pathways in accelerating sustainable agri-food system investments? What do you think about this, Regis?
Thank you, Maria. So for me, this is some of the fundamental cornerstones, really, of any actions to transform the food system into a more sustainable and just future. So basically, I feel that science-based pathways give us the road to transition in a way that is credible, that is strong, and that is agreeable among different experts. So, you know, there's a very big diversity of views in the world. And one way to agree into what could be the steps that we can take in a collaborative and, you know, order structured way is to follow what science is telling us. And, you know, I will leave it there. But for example, for science, for food and agriculture and 1.5 trajectories, for example, one step that we agree within the science that is really much needed first is to stop any deforestation. So we already have the first step on this road on what we need to do. So let's go there. It's just that science is also telling us that there's a lot of urgency in doing these things.
Yes, and I would fully agree with Reis, Maria, and I think that the science-based targets are very helpful, and I think in the future they should be paired with social science-based targets. So of course, the transition pathways that we have and the science-based targets are focused on environmental indicators, but we know that I think a couple of the biggest risk of those agricultural transitions that would not succeed is linked to social issues, as you also raised, Maria, in your introduction. So as long as poverty and inequality is a prevailing issue, then the agricultural transitions are at risk. So in IDH, we're also looking into what kind of science-based targets would be needed for the social part, now that we do have the science-based targets for the environmental part.
If I may follow up to both interesting consideration proposed, I will build on the issue, for instance, of deforestation. That's why at PARM we focus on analyzing risk and identifying tools to address this risk. Of course, deforestation is a huge issue, especially in the countries where we work, and to build on what Iris suggested about the social aspect. What we do at PARM is a holistic analysis of risk, which indeed includes the social, environmental, economic, institutional risks. So we will have a lot to discuss about. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for those interventions. Now, but I'm concerned more about how we can align all of this effort with the Paris Agreement and how this can help to address climate change challenges in the sector. How do you think that we can actually handle that?
It is, of course, a very big question, Maria, and one that not only us are making here, but the whole world, I guess. I think for the agri-food sector, one starting point is actually one of the things we're doing in Climate Bonds is trying to increase a lot the investments that are going into this direction on the actions that are needed for aligning the sector, the agri-food sector, to 1.5 trajectories. We're going to need a lot of investments. The latest IPCC report actually put some numbers into how much of these financial flows will need to increase from what they are at the moment in the agriculture sector, and that is we'll have to increase in the next 10 years between 10 and 30 times. So that's the amount of investment that is needed to actually get into this trajectory. For this particular question on investment, this is where Climate Bonds is developing these criteria and standards so that we can align those actions within this trajectory. But there are two elements here. One is alignment with the actions, and the second is bringing in more financial measure tools so that this can be really realized in a way that is just, as Francesca and Iris were saying, this really needs to incorporate not only the climate actions, but also everything that has to do with the social aspects. There's 500 million farmers in the world feeding 8 billion people. And these 500 million people really need to have a just well-being and labor conditions to continue to feed the world.
Yes, and maybe building on your point, I think what we know is that from all climate funds that are available, 7% currently is going to climate adaptation. So I would fully agree with you that capital is a key lever for change, but I think so far there has been insufficient attention to climate adaptation, and that's also something that we're seeing, for example, with some of the companies that we are working with who have very clear commitments to become net zero by 2030, 2035, somewhere in the future. And what we see happening is that they are investing in agricultural transitions with smallholder farmers or with farmer organizations, but often those investments have a duration of about 3 years. We know that agricultural transitions won't be finalized in a period of 3 years. So we are currently gathering data and some evidence on the risk of short-term investments for the companies that are working with those smallholder farmers. Because we expect that if they pull out after 3 years, farmers may still need investment because for them, the business case is not there yet in 3 years. If those companies, the private sector companies, pull out, the positive change that has been created in those 3 years may be undone. So I would say besides the availability of capital, it's also the availability of long-term capital that's needed. And I think as time is very limited, I think one other thing which I would like to add is that it will be very helpful, and I think the science-based targets will be a good enabler for that, but we probably need to accelerate learning, because if we all start learning in an isolated way and we all start gathering data that is slightly different from what others are doing, then this will hamper the speed the speed for which we can learn. And I think making sure that there is comparable and standardized data will allow us to learn quicker.
Thank you. If I may just elaborate further on these issues and climate adaptation, it's very critical, especially in the countries where we work. And maybe what we could focus on is the need for capital and how to attract this capital towards issues of climate adaptation. For instance, what we need is information, data that can help the investors somehow to foresee, anticipate, and help them to de-risk the investment. The risk is very high. It's something that pertains to the agriculture sector and many other sectors too, but notably in agriculture. So providing data, detailed data by value chain, what we try to do at PARM with our risk analysis aims at this, at de-risking investment, possibly to mobilize capital towards agriculture and especially climate adaptation, of course. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca. You had been mentioning different ingredients that actually support what I was saying at the beginning. I start saying that it's important to highlight how evaluating risk in agriculture can actually provide an informed decision-making. So my question now will be regarding how exactly does agriculture risk analysis support the transition to sustainable agriculture, in your opinion?
If I may build on that, because I felt like called by this question. Well, how can we support the transition to sustainable agriculture? Certainly by analyzing risk in the specific value chain in which we are working. What we propose to do at PARM is to really go step by step along the value chain to identify the actors, to identify the risk that they face at each different step, for which we need data, of course, quantitative and qualitative data, to be able to make sure that the transition doesn't get blocked at a step of the chain and doesn't go ahead. They really need to be working on a chain. So as I mentioned, we need to identify the actors, the data, and make sure that they work on a chain. And this may favor the transition to sustainable agriculture. Of course, I could turn the question to the audience if there are value chains. In some of the countries where we work, we could have a doubt. We analyze by value chain, but do they really work in a chain? These I will turn it to some local audience that may have an answer to that. Thank you very much.
Yes, and I would agree with you, Francesca, that analyzing risk along the value chain is helpful. And what we see is that it's not sufficient to analyze risk. So what we are starting to do more and more work about is to get into the discussion of risk distribution. Because when you know, when you have identified different types of risks at the different actors in the value chain, then of course you can start thinking about the transition plan. However, we, and probably you, are also very much aware that smallholder farmers are at the part of the value chain where they are having the most risks and having the least means to mitigate those risks. So I think analyzing risk for transition plans makes lots of sense and should be the basis for also starting to think on how to redistribute some of those risks along the value chain to get to successful transitions. And we often pair the discussion on risk distribution to the discussion on value distribution. And I think that also comes back to where Reyes started with the need for capital, because often smallholder farmers actually don't have the means to make the investments in the agricultural transitions. And why is that? Because if you look at in the Netherlands, we say if you have the full pie, then they only have a very small portion of that pie. So how can we either redistribute the pie, so smallholder farmers have a larger portion of the pie, or grow the pie so that all stakeholders have access to more value?
I wanted to add a thought. I mean, I agreeing with you too, but adding a thought going forward is that of a time frame. So when we are analyzing risks, often in the agri-food space, we focus a lot on the short-term risks, because this is what is immediately coming. We have a drought, we have to increase irrigation, and then we go and we build more irrigation infrastructure and so on. But if we really analyze that in terms of where natural resources are going to go under different climate scenarios, even the most ambitious scenario, 1.5 degrees of warming, increase of warming, is telling us that, you know, in many areas of the world, water is going to become more scarce. I'm in the south of Spain, and this is something that is in discussion every day. But my point is at the time frame, because if we focus more on the short term, we're losing sight of the mid and long-term risks and needs for adaptation and mitigation in those terms. And maybe the assets where we are investing for the short term are going to be stranded in the long term because they're not going to be really fit for the conditions we're going to have. Linking to the capital necessity of the farmers and on the whole system, on the whole transition. The transition needs to be so deep that mid long-term consideration really needs to be in place now, so that we don't go into, you know, dead ends in terms of capital and in terms of the injustice that it is for many of these small and medium and large farmers.
Yes, I think that's an excellent point, and I think that's often being overlooked. And it's difficult because I think especially for smallholder farmers, they don't have a long-term view. They're concerned about today and tomorrow, but I think you have a really excellent point also to make sure that those investments that are being made will have a long-lasting impact and not a short-term impact that would be evaporated, right, because of further climate change. So yeah, I think that's an excellent point.
And adding to your point, Iris, which I think is very important also, is that we often think we talk about these things and it's almost like the responsibility is with the farmers. But that's so untrue, no? And
Yes.
the whole responsibility of this transition, of course, the farmers have a very big role to play, but it's really from policy and private investments that these big infrastructures and transitions will need to happen. And this is where, you know, channeling this conversation towards those is really could make a difference also in the mid and long term. Of course, giving support to the farmers, but without them having the whole responsibility.
Thank you, Regis.
Then if I can build on all this, thank you very much for all your interesting contribution. Going back to the remark of Iris about the risk distribution, as I mentioned in the beginning, we do an analysis at each step of the value chain to indeed identify what you mentioned, what you call the risk distribution. We also consider the tools that the different actors dispose of. And I fully agree with you that the farmers are those who get the less of the benefits and the most of the risk. That's why among the tools to address risk, we consider risk transfer through, for instance, contract farming, warehouse, receipt system, and other type of practices. And as far as the risk, of course, is the farmer that gets most of it. That's why most of the analysis is focused on that. But what we try to do is also to consider a strong tool that they can dispose of, uniting themselves, organizing themselves in producer organization and cooperative, to then be fully equipped to enter a value chain. I don't want to say at equal terms and with the equal power of negotiation than other actors, but certainly on a good way to be able to negotiate, possibly in similar terms with the rest of the actors. Thank you.
Maria, can I add one more thing? Because I think Reyes indicated that the risk assessment is really relevant, but that also we need to take into account, right? At what time frame are we looking at? I also do want to highlight, I think, maybe an unintended consequence of those risk assessments, which we are experiencing, which is whenever companies start looking at their own footprints and how to get to their net zero commitments, that there is quite a tendency to move away from those sourcing areas where there are the biggest risks, because there it will be most difficult to get to both environmental and social improvements. So although I think the risk assessment tools are very helpful to get to an understanding and to design transition plans also for long term, we shouldn't close our eyes for those unintended consequences, because what's happening if there are certain areas that are all, if they have a list of hotspots. So I don't know whether that's also terminology used in your work, but if you have a list of hotspots and there is consequently certain regions are in the top 3 of those hotspots, then most likely, if companies have an alternative, they will move away from those areas instead of investing significantly, as these are areas with significant risks. And I think this type of behavior may be accelerated because of upcoming regulation in the EU, which either require companies to be compliant or at least to have transparency on their full supply chain. I want to highlight that, Maria, because I think, yes, it's a very helpful tool, but let's not forget about some of the unintended consequences, and also let's think, right, because on how to deal with such unintended consequences.
I agree with you.
If I may build on that, just to avoid misunderstandings, we don't do risk assessment per company. So maybe I will send you the link to our website, because we do a risk assessment by value chain, not per company. And the social and environmental risk are a constant element of our analysis. Thank you very much.
No, thanks, Francesca, for adding that. I just want to highlight, that's what I understand, that you're not doing it for companies, but companies are doing this as well. And I think, and investors as well, right? So let's not shut our eyes for some of the not so wanted effects of using data and transparency.
No, I think that what Aris is trying to say is that it's not just a matter of risk assessment. I think that it's a matter of using different tools and resources that can help us to make the trajectory to net zero. So for example, risk assessment is one of them, but as well having criteria and frameworks that let us understand how we can meet that final goal to arrive to net zero is the key to actually the transition of the sector. So it's about putting all of those tools together and be able to arrive to that final goal. But it's not just about focusing in risk assessments only, because of course it's a more global analysis that must be done. Thank you for your comments. Now, I think that is very interesting to get into how inclusive finance can be achieved in agricultural value chain. And you were bringing a lot of elements that actually are taken into consideration in inclusive finance. So I would like to ask you, can inclusive finance be achieved in agricultural value chain, or do you think that it's not possible to achieve it?
In my opinion, it can be achieved as long as you provide the farmers with the right tools. First of all, of course, you could speak of digitalization, which is itself a tool with all the limits that comes also with digitalization, because not everybody has access to internet or even a mobile phone. This could be one way to ensure inclusivity for the farmers. And of course, also counting on impact investors that may have among their own priorities also to ensure inclusivity. What we try to do certainly is always to diversify the categories of participants to our activities, so that we start with including them since the beginning and then channeling them towards having contact or meeting with investors that have among their priorities working with small farmers. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca.
Yeah, I would agree with Francesca that it is possible. I do think it's difficult. Why? Because this requires longer term finance. So I think agriculture finance is already a challenge, especially for smaller farmers and SMEs. And for these transitions, there's a need for longer term finance. I fully agree with Francesca that digitalization can be a way to bring down risks and costs. And I think there are a few platforms that are promising that show that by using a digital platform, they can reach many farmers. However, I do think we may need other interventions, and I would like to highlight that the government in India, and that's already for quite a period, but they have put in regulation to the local banks on what percentage of their portfolio they have to lend into certain priority sectors, and agriculture is one. And I think to make sure that there's inclusive finance at scale, we may also need those kind of regulatory interventions, because we know that inclusive finance is already a challenge for short-term finance.
Yeah, I mean, the question is, because inclusive finance could include all finance, no? So I would say it is possible, and I agree, we need to be optimistic and positive, but I would maybe answer thinking more about green finance and what it could mean for green finance to be more inclusive. And in that sense, we have mentioned a few times already, but in the work we are doing in climate bonds to create standards and criteria for certification on green financial tools, anything related to social and economic inclusivity could be included as safeguards. So we have a strong focus on 1.5 transition pathways for mitigation and adaptation, but those measures that we will be including there will have these safeguards so that the social aspects, the economic aspects, the smallholder, middle or large scale farmers could be included into that decision making going forward into how that finance could be used. And I mean, it's always difficult when we bring it down to examples, because some of those examples can be quite complex and difficult, and painful sometimes. But if we talk about the just transition going forward, we know that agriculture uses a lot of the land on the world, around 38% of the land is used by agriculture. It's very limited. We have to share it with nature. We have to share it with many other uses, and it's very limited. So what we do in this with this land going forward to 2040, 50, it's gonna influence a lot on food security, for example, because that's where the food is going to be needed to grow on some land that if it is not used for food, if it is used for bioenergy, for example, it's not going to be used for food. So there's going to be very difficult decisions going forward into this transition in how land is used that is going to affect very much the inclusivity of very large parts of the population in the farming communities across the world. So I would say it's a big challenge, but one that through safeguarding, focus on social and economic aspects within these criteria, could be a step forward, I would think.
Yes, and I think, guys, that it is important to pay more attention to those trade-offs, because we often see that they're not fully overlooked, but often people don't have enough insights into those trade-offs. So and we see, I think there are various examples of trade-offs. So I think also due to the war in the Ukraine and what we've seen in sub-Saharan Africa is that some countries chose to focus a lot on food security and actually obliged farmers to produce certain crops as those were key for food security, which makes lots of sense. But those crops are not the best income generating crops for those farmers. So although that has been very helpful for increasing food security, it hasn't been so helpful for improving farmer incomes. And I think that also for inclusive finance, it's helpful to become more aware of those trade-offs. And I don't think we can always avoid them, but at least be very conscious and more intentional on what kind of trade-offs we find acceptable when finance is being provided.
Thank you, Iris.
Can I provide an example of the importance the Iris mentioned about the difference between food crops and cash crops? It is indeed a big issue, and it happened to us in some countries, notably Madagascar. Farmers were not able to make the difference between the two types of crops. Frankly, they didn't know the nutrition component of certain crop, and they were trying to sell it in the market. So the local consumption of nutrition went down, and their income wasn't going up because it's not exactly a cash crop what they were selling. So what we're trying to do in the country now, indeed, is to focus our risk assessment into different chains, one for local consumption and one for cash crops to sell it in the market. And some people say, just let them sell it in the market anywhere, and then they will do with the revenue whatever they want to do. But at the same time, with them, it's important to focus on nutrition crops and also analyze nutrition crops to ensure food security. Thank you.
Now, following what the three of you were mentioning, how we can make a lasting impact for transition to mainstream? I know that these questions are not easy.
Yeah, very difficult ones, but because this is also thinking, at least in my head, it starts to think about the long-term impacts and effects of what we do now in the short term. So for me, if I think about investments and risks on what can we do so that the sustainable become mainstream, I would say that maybe there are like two main avenues, in very simplifying very much, but one would be pioneering the new elements that we really see in a future sustainable and just agri-food system. So what are those new elements? And I give you an example. Many of the all of the climate pathways for 1.5 in agri-food include a very strong decline in meat consumption globally, especially in over-consuming regions. So the global diet in the future, in these pathways that align with 1.5, will have a lot less meat than they have now. In some regions, there might be more, but in most regions, there's a decline. So this is a long-term trend in these kind of pathways that already can have new elements that we want to incorporate into the system now that would need investments now so that become mainstream in 2050. So that's one element. The other element could be disinvestment, no? So taking away investments from things that we don't want to see in 2050 in those 1.5 pathways for climate and for justice and so on. One example that I brought out before, it was deforestation. So if we think already the pathways are telling us that deforestation needs to be zero by 2030, net zero by 2030 in all of the IPCC models that align with 1.5, it means that now anything that has to do with deforestation cannot be in the mainstream in 2050. And what do we do for that? And then, there's a recent report from UNEP on how to finance for this transition. And actually, there's a very worrying fact in there that says that 62% of the financial institutions that are investing or lending to companies that are exposed to deforestation do not have a policy on deforestation, when we know this is something that needs to be mainstream very soon. So this is like a space where a lot of things need to change in the very short term to being able to align with this mainstream 1.5 in the future. So focusing on the new and disinvestment is investing from the things that will be obsolete in a few years.
Thank you, Regis. I can see that Francesca and Ares are taking notes. So do you want to add anything to this point?
Maybe one thing. I think building on the 2 points that Ares shared, I think also institutionalization will be key to create lasting impact. So I think we will need governments that are able to make sure that private sector, but also other actors in a country are able to comply, and there are compliance mechanisms. So I think on the one hand, to create lasting impact, you need to have the right interventions. I think on the other hand, we need to make sure that there are the control mechanisms, there are the data points to actually make sure that the change in behavior that is needed is actually being measured and being controlled by the different regulatory bodies that would have the mandate to do so. So I think to create a lasting impact, and we also need the regulatory part and probably the right incentives for those governments, and maybe especially governments in the global south, to play that role. Because I think we're all aware that those countries that contribute least to climate change have still most of the forest to conserve, to preserve. So how do we, besides the innovations and the stopping investing in certain sectors, should come together with the right incentive package and empowering of governments in the global south to make sure that that the new behavior is actually being implemented and being rewarded, and that the trade-off, which we talked about before, is minimized, but also that the incentives for preserving forest or for reforestation, for example, are bigger than the economic advantage of deforesting and using it for agricultural purposes.
Thank you, Iris. Francesca, I want to ask you regarding this because I know that FARM works very close with governments. So I think that you can share with us more about that main goal that you have with the platform and how you're working with governments.
Thank you very much. Indeed, as you were saying, farm services are demanded by the government. So we intervene once the government asks for our technical assistance. And to go back to the initial question, how we ensure lasting impact, especially in our case of our intervention, we have a process indeed called institutionalization, where we accompany all our partners, which can be academics, research centers, farmer organizations, investors, and the government. To integrate agricultural risk management, we have a specific methodologies to assess risk, which I invite you to go and check on our website, and we welcome all type of comments and suggestions. So we accompany our partners to integrate agricultural risk management in, for instance, the curriculum of university, but also the training centers of microfinance institutions need to train their clients and their own personnel to be able to analyze risk in agriculture. And last but not least, we also accompany the governments to integrate agricultural risk management in their policies, so that they can actually take over the entire job and we make ourselves redundant. And normally it's the government that has the total ownership of the process in our case, which doesn't mean that the private sector is excluded, not at all. Actually, the governments should create an enabling environment and provide the seed capital guarantees that can facilitate the intervention of the private sectors through, which can be a blended finance or private-public partnerships, with all the difficulties that can go along with that. We're not saying that our approach is the only one of the best, but we are truly aware of the advantages and the challenges that need to be taken into account. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francesca. I am aware that agriculture is quite heterogeneous, and sometimes thinking about how we can adapt risk management tools to the different risk of levels, sectors, regions, farm sizes, commodities is a challenge. It's really a challenge. So do you think that we can discuss about a standardization in the sector, or this is something that is not possible to imagine inside agriculture?
Well, I think it's possible, Maria. We did it, or we're doing it, well, although at a far smaller scale, that's needed. So what we did in IDH, we developed methodology to analyze inclusive business models, and we're applying this for different commodities in different contexts with different type of companies. So I think it should be doable as long as there is room to bring in the specific context of either a commodity or region, or a specific context of a farmer or value chain player that's involved. However, Maria, this is not happening by itself. So I do think that we need a larger community that's willing to use the same standardized tools, where there's also willingness to share that data into a database to be hosted by a organization, to allow for also more aggregated analysis and insights. Because if that standardization is not happening, there will be change, but it will be changed in silos, and there will be lots of reinventing the wheel type of activities, which is a waste of resources and time that we can't afford anymore, I would say.
Thank you.
So, I would say here that, when we talk about standardization, for me, this is where kind of science comes to the rescue, if you allow me, because really, and forgive me if I'm going to focus again on climate, but I believe this can be applied to other aspects, also social justice, economics. So it is true that agriculture is very context specific. We all know this. But I fear that this has often been an excuse for agri-food sector companies and so on to be part of the climate conversation around raising ambition and about being part of the solution. And I don't have the number in my head right now, but I think it's less than 10% of the national determined contribution plans by countries, which are the plans that the countries have to present to the UNFCCC on the climate actions. So very few of them actually include mitigation from the agriculture sector. But there's 33% of emissions come from the food system. And between 20 and 30% of the mitigation could come from the same sector, from the agriculture sector. So it is a problem and a solution, and the context specificity cannot be an excuse. And with this, I say that, it's very clear from the science that agriculture needs to be both a sink of carbon, so we need to sequester as much carbon as possible, and this is in all climate models on the land sector, both from forestry and agriculture. So we need to increase that capacity to sink carbon, and that can be done in many different ways that are context specific, but it's not escaping from this fact that we need to include removals of CO2 in the soil. And there's ways that farmers can do this in a way that builds resilience and also that build economic profitability. The second is that we need to reduce emissions, and that, you know, there's standards in emission of gases that can be applied in many different contexts with different particular specificities and so on, that allow farmers and companies to set targets that are standard across many global situations and still allowing for the specificity. So I went a little bit into the technical comments there, but allow me to say that I'm passionate that yes, agriculture can have standards that are globally applicable and can really ease in this transition towards climate safe and justice systems.
Thank you, Regis, for the deep dive.
If I can just elaborate further on this interesting contributions. Yes, sure, standardization is the advantage of giving us a common language, so we understand each other, especially when it comes, for instance, to voluntary sustainability standards. That's a clear language that we can share between farmers and investors to facilitate the dialogue, and why not involving also the governments that can facilitate implementation in the country. However, standardization should not be there to hamper innovation, which could actually be the case, but this can be taken into account in different ways to facilitate the flexibility to allow the context and the specificity to be examined too. And maybe to build also on what Reyes was saying about storing of carbon. Certainly, it's a big asset the farmer have nowadays. It's the carbon. And I'm sure that we all agree that maybe the price of carbon per ton should reflect a little bit more what's behind the process. In my opinion, I would propose $200. Well, I don't know what the other think, but maybe a bit too much. But less than that, we are not making up for the cost of it. Thank you.
I'm gonna take one question from the audience. This question will be for you, Regis. What kind of commodity sector will cover the agriculture criteria that we're developing here in CBI? There is any limitation, any preference?
So we are starting with a crop and livestock, with the scope is food commodities. So it could include update the current existing criteria that is covering any food crop, either for food or for feed and livestock. So that's the boundary of what we're doing right now. And then we will do also the commodity value chain, which again, we will include the whole food value chain. So it will be only focused on food. So it will not include like good products, for example, or bioenergy. It will be crops that are used for food. But on that, it will try to cover as much as possible of the different contexts and different entities that could apply for this certification within the standards from climate bonds.
Thank you, Regis. I just want to remind the audience that, of course, this is a conversation that we can continue. So it's not just about today's webinar. Feel free to reach to our speakers for getting all the details about what they are leading. Now, I have a question for you, Francesca. And given the unique investment opportunities that are in different regions and countries, how does PARM tackle global agriculture risk management? Because it depends, really. So how PARMS does it?
Thank you, Maria. This is a very interesting point. Yes, you're right. Indeed, the investment opportunities belong to a country and we work by country. So our analysis and investments are by country. However, the global aspect of it, the global aspect of risk management comes out when we consider the investors and the donors we work with. The donors we work with and that finance our work are working at global level. So they have a global mission, a global vision. and we must adapt and align to their global vision and global mission. So whenever we do an intervention in a country, it's always like integrated or aligned with the global perspective. Yes, we are working on a specific investment in a specific country, but there is always the global vision. And just a practical example, we all our donors have regional offices, so that allows to keep in a more global view. And we need to work with them, and we work with them to benefit from this global perspective. Thank you. I hope it answers your question.
It does, Francesca. Thank you so much. You provide us with more insights about what Farm is doing. And once again, it would be amazing to get through all the details, but of course we don't have the time to do that. So I'm sure that we will find the right place to continue learning more about your work. Iris, I know as well that you are leading an amazing work fostering learning and innovation across commodities and regions. So we would like to learn more about how AD-ASH is actually doing this work, how you are helping smallholders to gain access to innovative finance.
Thanks, Maria, for the question. We are working together with the private sector. So we're not an organization that's directly working with smallholder farmers or with farmer organizations. Our entry point is to work with market demand, and based on market demand, see how we can strengthen value chains. And that's also how we try to organize the finance, so along the value chain. So we are working with, for example, large off-takers and are leveraging their off-take contracts to create access to finance for small and medium enterprises. And we then also support those small and medium enterprises, how they can increase their sourcing from smallholder farmers, and how they can also support smallholder farmers with access to finance. And such access to finance can take different type of forms. So it can be access to finance through the SME itself, or through a large off-taker. Can be access to finance where we work with a tripartite agreement with a local financial service provider, where the off-take contracts are seen as one of the securities. But we also are working quite a bit on innovative finance structures and platforms that are using alternative credit scoring are an important mechanism to create more access to finance at scale, because I think that's still what we are working on, and what also is seen as quite a challenge. So we can create some islands of success, but we don't want only islands of success. We want to create change at scale.
Thank you, Iris. I have one more question from the audience, and I know that we are running out of time, so let me jump directly to that question. This question will be for all of you. Are there globally standardized methodologies for agricultural risk assessment or analysis? What are some of these methodologies?
Well, there are certainly very many, and the farm has its own agricultural risk methodologies. They can find it in our website. All the publications, all the methodologies explained in detail on our website. But if they want to know more, they can just write us. I repeat, it's not the only methodology. There are very many, but ours, they can find it on our website. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francesca. Regis and Iris, you would like to add anything?
Sorry, yes, no, on the specific methodologies, I won't be able to add anything, but I think in general, risk analysis of agriculture, in general, across specifically looking at climate, the latest IPCC report, the synthesis report, on the summary, so you don't have to read the 600 pages, but on the 30 pages summary, there's some very good graphs showing what are the reasons for concerns in different ecosystems and land-based uses like agriculture. So it has analysis on how yields would change, how seasonality might change. So that's kind of a overarching science and analysis that could be helpful to start to look into what are the risks of impacting agriculture in the mid and long term.
And no additions from my side, Maria.
Thank you. So I would like to ask you this final question to close the panel. And this is regarding our main purpose of today's conversation. We have been talking about how to mobilize global capital for financing the transition in agriculture. And through all the several comments that you have been sharing today, we had realized that this is not just a matter of one person, one entity, one sector. This is somehow an effort that we should all work together, from the public side, from the public sector to the financial field, but as well taking into consideration the corporate stakeholders and farmers, of course. So considering that our audience is quite diverse and we have different profiles and different entities, I would like to ask you for your advice. How do you think that they can be part of the change?
I'm happy to start, Maria. I think how we approach it also with other wicked problems like income, wages, gender equality is that I think there are always things that stakeholders can do individually. So I think it's very important that it's a huge challenge, right? So you can easily become overwhelmed and freeze because it's too big of a challenge. But I think there are quite a few organizations that can help different types of stakeholders with taking individual action. And I think then the other thing which is very helpful is to find multi-stakeholder initiatives where those different stakeholders come together, because we know that the individual action will not be sufficient. So we know that collaboration between different stakeholders will be needed. And as IDH, we are convening different types of these kind of multi-stakeholder initiatives also in specific landscapes across the world. So we're active in 30 landscapes, and there are organizations like IDH that can play this neutral role of bringing together multiple stakeholders.
If I can build on that, yes, I truly like the idea of a multi-stakeholder collaboration, as long as it's possible to identify each other roles and responsibilities to make sure where the input is coming from. Sometimes we also want to measure that. To answer Maria's question, well, I think sustainable consumption and sustainable production, there are practices and there are standards and certification to ensure sustainable production, sustainable consumption. And what we do indeed at PARM is trying to promote an holistic approach that involves all actors and all aspects of risk, social, economic, and environmental. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, for me, I would jump in just quickly to say that. So I would say to stakeholders, just reach out, one. So in the climate bonds, we are starting a process with industry to develop these standards. So reach out to be part of the industry working group if you want, in this process that will last for at least 12 months. So we can engage and see how the certification process would apply to your entity or financial institution and so on. And the second would be, we really need to transition. So we are starting to build these pathways for transition. So again, watch out and apply for certification, if you like, with climate bonds to really look into what could mean for a company to align with 1.5 or to start to align into this transition. I will leave it there.
Thank you, Regis. So yes, we are arriving at the end of this panel, for which I really would like to thank you. Oh, I'm sorry, I thought that we were losing the connection. Okay, sorry. I really would like to thank you, Regis, Francesca, and Iris, for sharing all your knowledge and opinion. Once again, this is a conversation that can continue for hours, days, and months, I think, but we don't have the time. So that's why I would like to actually encourage everyone at the audience to reach to each one of you, and as well to me, if you would like to know more about how we can join forces, how we can work together, and of course, more about the work that we're leading. But we would like to hear as well from you, who you are and how you're taking part of this change once again. So thank you so much for joining us. And please remember that we are here to commit with that path to net zero. So we can make it possible. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.